So this particular part of the specification looks at Romanian orphanages and the effects of institutionalization. And when we use the word institution, what we mean is it's a place that is dedicated to a particular task. It might be looking after children who are awaiting adoption, it might be looking after the mentally ill. In our case, we're going to be looking at orphanages. And this is where children live for a period of time. And in the past, a lot of these places have offered very, very little emotional care. They've offered very little stimulation to the children. Sometimes children are malnourished in them. And the main weakness of them is that they didn't offer any real stimulation or emotional support for the children in the institutions. So you need to know about Romanian orphans, and I just want to give you a bit of background into how this situation arose. So in 1966, there was a dictator in Romania, and in order to boost the population there, he tried to encourage families having very large families, so having a lot of children, and put a ban on abortion. And what happened obviously was that many of these babies couldn't be looked for, cared for by the families. Families may have been poor in the first place, then having a lot of children to feed, and families just couldn't do it. So when the regime came to an end in 1989, in Romania you had 100,000 orphans in 600 state-run orphanages. And the orphanages, as you can see on the last photo and this photo here, there was very, very little stimulation in the orphanages. And you'll see in the photos throughout this video lesson that the conditions were absolutely awful. They spent days alone in their cribs, they'd be malnourished, no stimulation, no play. They wouldn't have the adults coming over, giving them the love that every children really requires in order to develop properly. So, one of the main studies that's been done is by Rutter on the Romanian orphans. The aim of his study was to test the extent to which good care can make up for poor early experiences in institutions. So, what he did was he had 165 Romanian orphans, and they were adopted by British families. Some were adopted before 6 months, some were adopted before the age of 2, some were adopted after the age of 2. So we've got 3 real groups that Rutter had as an experiment. Before 6 months, before 2 years, and after 2 years. They were all adopted by British families. And these children then were assessed at age 4, at age 6, age 11, and age 15. And they assessed them for their physical, social, and cognitive development. And they also had a control group of 52 British adopted children who were adopted all at the same time as the Romanian children. And what we're going to have a look at now is what he found for these different types of development. So for intellectual development, at the age of 11, those children adopted before 6 months had an IQ of 102. If you adopted before 2 years, dropped to 86. If you adopted after 2 years, your IQ dropped further to 77. And these differences remained when they were reassessed at 15 years. Their IQs had increased, but there was still this drop every time they were adopted. So it shows that intellectual development can be recovered as long as you are adopted before the age of 6 months. So if you get adopted then, your IQ will be similar to those British children who were also adopted in the control group. Rutter also investigated whether children had attachment issues. And what he found was that those children adopted after 6 months all showed signs of disinhibited attachment. So they all had attachment issues if they were adopted after 6 months. They were attention seeking, clingy, they treated strangers with over familiarity, like you'd expect to treat a member of your own family. And Rutter said that this may have been a result of them maybe having 50 different carers coming around the institution, an orphanage. So they never really had an opportunity to develop secure attachments, so they just had to develop and be over-friendly with any person that possibly came near them in order to get some form of attention. So we're going to have a quick look at the evaluation points for Rutter's study. So there is obviously a cultural bias. It's only based on Romanian orphans. So therefore, we might not be able to generalise the results of this particular study to other populations, because we'd be unsure we'd get the same results if we conducted it in different cultures. And also, the conditions were so bad in the Romanian orphanages, like we said, there was no physical, social or emotional stimulation at all for the children, that it might not even be possible to apply these findings to other institutions either. So we might not be able to apply it to other cultures, we might not also be able to apply it to other institutions. So, another issue was that the last assessment was only at the age of 15. So we don't know the effects of institutions and whether they are carried on into adult life. It may be that those children in the institutions who were adopted after 2 years could still catch up with their emotional, physical and social and cognitive development later on in life. Because it was only done up to the age of 15, we're unsure of the effects into later life. A further weakness is that the children weren't randomly assigned into conditions. So we didn't have some adopted before, after 2 years, before 2 years. They weren't randomly assigned to these conditions. So possibly the children adopted earliest may just have been more sociable children. And therefore, those children who were adopted and were more sociable were always going to show less emotional and social and cognitive underdevelopment. They were always going to be able to catch up because they were the more sociable children in the orphanages, and that's why they were selected to be adopted by the British families. So the fact that they weren't randomly assigned to these conditions is a major weakness of this experiment, and therefore becomes a confounding variable. So, what did Rutter's study find then? We found that there's definitely intellectual underdevelopment if you spend longer than 6 months in an institution. We saw that with their IQ scores. And we also saw that children show attachment issues, this disinhibited attachment, the fact they become attention-seeking and clingy. But what do other studies show? Do they show similar effects of institutions on development? Well, the first study we're going to have a look at is Quinton's study. And Quinton compared 50 women brought up in an institution with 50 women raised at home. And what he found was that the women brought up in an institution lacked warmth when they interacted with their own children. And they also were more likely to have children who spent time in care. So it shows us that when these women who were brought up in an institution were in their 20s, they had severe difficulties acting as parents. So it potentially has issues later on when you're trying to be a parent. We've also got Zeanah's Bucharest early intervention study. And what they did here was they got 95 children who had spent most of their lives in an institution. And they also had a control group of 50 children who had spent no time in an institution. And they put these children into the strange situation and asked carers about any unusual social behaviour as well. So they had the children early on in the study, put them into the strange situation, and also asked carers about any unusual social behaviour with their peers, whether they're attention-seeking, clingy, etc. And what they found was that 74% of that control group, the ones who spent no time in an institution, were securely attached. However, only 19% of the institution group were classed as securely attached. So you can see there's a clear difference in the attachment issues for the institution group. And also, the institution group were far more likely to show this disinhibited attachment, the attention-seeking, the over-familiarity with strangers. So it clearly has attachment issues for you. Okay, and this is a bit of a better experiment than Rutter's because the children have been put into that group. We've got our institution group, we've got our control group. However, these studies have had a real positive real-world application. It's led to a lot of improvements in how children are cared for in care homes. So now, as a result of these Romanian orphanage studies, we avoid large numbers of caregivers and care workers with each child. Each child will now have 1 or 2 key workers assigned to that particular child. If they're in an orphanages, if they're even in nurseries, they'll have a key worker assigned to that child. And this increases the chances for that child to develop a secure attachment, because we already saw in the orphanage studies that they may have had 50 different people coming to them. There's no chance for them to develop that secure attachment. If each child only has 1 or 2 key workers, that increases the chances that they're able to develop a secure attachment.